Hello, beautiful lights, and welcome to another episode of From a Medium's Perspective. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Today, I'm going to be talking with you about psychometry. And psychometry is the art of touch and tell, and we'll be talking in great depth about that. In the second half of our show, possibly before, I'm going to start sharing some stories of psychometric experiences that I've had in our Tales from the Other Side. And I'll leave you with some tips on how you can develop your abilities. And we'll be focusing, of course, on psychometry today. Exactly what is psychometry? Psychometry, the word itself, comes from the Greek language. And it comes from the first syllable psyche, which is, or psyche, which is the word for spirit in Greek, or soul, and metron, or measure, which is also the Greek word for measurement. So psychometry is, I guess, measuring the spirit or souls, and it has also been called the token object reading. And I think what they mean by that is people will sometimes bring to a reading or to a medium for assessment or analysis an object and have them touch it and tell them the stories on that. Another word that I wasn't familiar when I started researching the show that I found was psychoscopy, but I tend to lean towards psychometry. I kind of like that. Sounds nice and tidy. You know, objects have an energy field that transfer knowledge or images regarding the object's history. Strong emotion has a physical effect on objects and can embed their stories into that physical object. It can be a place, a building, a home, or a piece of jewelry, a piece of clothing, a wall. And in some law enforcement agencies, psychometry has been used by psychic detectives when they've been called in on particular special cases. I don't think most police departments use psychic detectives, but there are some that do, some here locally in our area as well. And I think that's pretty cool. When I was working as a real estate broker, I actually gave it up in 2014 so that I could dedicate myself to my current work as a psychic medium. There were some homes that, as a realtor, I really didn't feel comfortable entering because of the energies that I felt in them, or parts of them that I couldn't enter, maybe a room or a portion of the house. And I would get a distinct impression in some of the other ones about some of the things that had happened there, whether it had been happy family gathering place or whether it had been a place of arguments or physical abuse. It just was something that I could pick up on. And a little later in the show, I'll be sharing some examples of just that. But I'd like to read a snippet from Wikipedia and give you some historical background on the art of psychometry. Joseph Rhodes Buchanan coined the word psychometry. He was the first one to use it, at least in our record. He considered it measuring the soul. And that was way back in 1842. He came up with the idea that all things give off emanation. And he said, and I quote, "The past is entombed in the present. The world is its own enduring monument, and that which is true of its physical is likewise true of its mental career. The discoveries of psychometry will enable us to explore the history of man, and those of geology enable us to explore the history of Earth. There are mental fossils for psychologists as well as mineral fossils for geologists. And I believe that hereafter, the psychologist and the geologist will go hand in hand, the one portraying the earth, its animals, and its vegetation, while the other portrays the human beings who have roamed over its surface in the shadows and in the darkness of primeval barbarism. The mental telescope is now discovered, which may pierce the depths of the past and bring us in full view of the grand and tragic passages of ancient history." I just love the archaic language. It sounds a little bizarre, but I just love it. And Buchanan asserted that his particular type of psychism would supersede empiric science, that it would actually elevate the various schools of philosophy and the arts, affecting a wide social change and ultimately enlighten humanity. And perhaps we're in the beginning of that shift. And wow, who knew that psychometry could have that kind of impact? Buchanan goes on to say that the thermometer measures caloric thermotemperature, the barometer measures baro weight of the atmosphere, the electrometer measures electrical conditions, the psychometer measures the soul. In the case of psychometry, however, the measuring assumes a new character, as the object measured and the measuring instrument are the same psychic element, and that this psychic capacity was really the measure of all things in the universe. Like I said, wow. Buchanan continued to promote psychometry throughout his life. His followers believed that science would be revolutionized in a comprehensive way, and they were calling it the dawn of a new civilization. And that was over 100 years ago in 1878. There was actually an article that came out in the New York Times stating that psychometry demonstrated that the sympathy between mind and body is an exact science. Now, I'm pretty sure that, at least in general, the idea of psychometry has still not caught on to the level that it's being esteemed as an exact science. As of yet, it hasn't revolutionized popular thought to any great extent, but it is, at least for me, and perhaps you that are out there listening, a really fascinating concept. The idea that the stories of our lives leave a signature that can be felt or read by us on the physical objects that we touch and are impressed into the features of the physical environments that we come into contact with. It's really very interesting. I ran across a website, paranormal.about.com/cs/ESP information, and they said that psychometry is a form of scrying, a psychic way of seeing something not ordinarily seeable. Some people can scry using a crystal ball, black glass, or even the surface of water, and with psychometry, this extraordinary vision is available through touch. Well, I would personally dispute the use of the term scrying, because I think of scrying as looking at something and allowing your brain to shift from its left analytical side to the right intuitive creative side and bring through the images and messages attached to the person sitting there or to the history of that object. So I'd like to say that psychometry to me is more of a clairsentient or empathic gift, being able to feel the stories and experience them through the objects. Let's get back to what paranormalabout.com has to say. They give an example that a person who has psychometric abilities, and they call them a psychometrist, so I guess I'm a psychometrist, can hold, for example, an antique glove and be able to tell something about the history of that glove, about the person who owned it, about the experiences that person had while they owned that glove or were in possession of that glove, and that the psychic might be able to sense what the person was like, what they did, and even perhaps how they died. Even more importantly, the psychic can sense how the person felt, the emotions of the person at a particular time in space. And emotions, especially, it seems, are the most strongly recorded in the object. And that I have to agree to. I think emotions are the language of the soul and definitely are what we as mediums use to interpret what it is that we feel and sense from a person or an object. They go on to say that the psychic may not be able to do this with all objects at all times. As with all psychic abilities, accuracy can vary, but this ability is available to the psychic. In response to that, I'd like to say that I do believe that it is quite possible to develop a high degree of accuracy, approaching 100%, if not 100%, and I've shared reasons for that in previous episodes. Well, Buchanan, the American professor of physiology that I mentioned earlier, was one of the first people that experimented with psychometry. He used his students as subjects. In one experiment, he placed different drugs in glass vials. Then he asked his students to identify the drugs solely by holding the vials. And their success rate was statistically impressive. It was way more than random chance. To explain the phenomenon, Buchanan proposed a theory that all objects have souls that retain a memory. Now, I'm not sure that I think of objects having souls per se, but I do know that life is interconnected. Who's to say where sentience or consciousness begins and ends? If plants are able to respond to music and positive or negative words, the emissions in animal brains have been measured, and they found out recently in dogs that when a dog is looking at their owner or companion, that they are emitting frequencies identical to the human frequencies of love. All things are connected in a matrix in terms of the physical expression of life. So who's to say where it starts or stops? Is a rock conscious? Is a tree? If a tree is, does its consciousness continue as it's transformed into lumber and becomes a house? And those are questions for another day, I'm sure. There was also, in keeping with the history of psychometry, an American professor of geology, William F. Denton, and he was intrigued and inspired by Buchanan's work and conducted his own experiments to see if psychometry would work with his geological specimens, core samples and different rocks that he had collected. And this was in the mid-1800s, 1854. He actually enlisted the help of his sister. Her name was Anne Denton Cridge to help. And he wrapped some of these rock samples in cloth so that Anne couldn't even see what type they were, placed the wrapped bundle to her forehead, and she was actually able to describe the contents accurately enough through the vivid mental images that she received. Very interesting. She was completely able to pick up what it was that was in there or describe its characteristics. And a few years later, in the early 1900s, I guess 50 years is not a few years for us on the physical plane, but in the early 1900s, Gustav Pangenscher, and please forgive my horrific pronunciation of that name. It looks like Pagenstischer. He was a German doctor. Gustav, I can say that, was a German doctor and psychical researcher. So he was a doctor and he was very interested in metaphysics. And he had a particular patient. Her name was Maria Reyes de Zerold. Maria had some psychometric abilities, and when she went into trance and held an object, she was able to state facts about its past and about its present. And she would describe the sights and sounds and smells and other feelings about the object's, aka experience in the world. Gustav theorized that a psychometrist could tune into the experiential vibrations that are condensed in the object. Now, again, I'm not convinced that it's the object actually telling the story. I think it could be more that the object has been bombarded with the energies of sentient life, with the emotions and stories of the people who came in contact with it. But maybe I'm limited in thinking that. Could a rock tell the history of the cultures that lived and walked by it? Or is it a static palette, sort of a canvas that the stories of other lives become painted on as they occur nearby? It's interesting to contemplate for sure. Michael Talbot says that psychometric abilities suggest that the past is not lost, but still exists in some form accessible to human perception. With the scientific knowledge that all matter on a subatomic level exists essentially as vibrations, Talbot asserts that consciousness and reality exist in a kind of hologram that contains a record of the past, the present, and the future, all time, and that psychometrics might be a tool to tap into that record. All actions, he says, instead of fading into oblivion, remain recorded in the cosmic hologram and can always be accessed once again. I kind of like Calbett's explanation. There are other psychical researchers that think that the information about an object's past is recorded in the aura of the object. I don't know how many of you out there can see the auras that are inherent in nature and animals. I have a friend who can see auras not only around people, but around trees and that kind of thing, and the field of energy surrounding every object. That really resonates with me as well because I see them. I guess it's interesting to think that that information is embedded in the aura of physical objects. According to an article that I found at The Mystica, the connection between psychometry and auras is based on the theory that the human mind radiates an aura in all directions and around the entire body, which impresses everything within its orbit. So all objects, no matter how solid they appear, are porous and contain small or even minute holes. And these minute crevices in the object's surface collect minute fragments of the mental aura of the person possessing the object or touching the object, influencing the object. And since the brain generates the aura, then something worn near the head would transmit better vibrations. Well, I think it's our whole being does, because also I think our intelligence is actually in our gut, in our solar plexus chakra. That's where our knowing is. Our thoughts are in our brain, our emotions in our heart, but our knowing is actually in our solar plexus chakra. But an interesting thought at the Mystica. From science, we know that physical matter isn't solid. There are spaces between the molecules that outdistance the actual molecules themselves. It's the void between that is larger than the actuality of the physicality of the molecules. And in a previous episode, we talked about the perception from the astral realm, how we see things once we're there, when we first cross over, and how things look just like they are here, but the particles that make up the objects in the physical realm can be seen as a particulate. So maybe it has to do with perception. In another article, Psychometry-Psychic Gifts Explained, they liken the ability to a tape recorder, that since our bodies give off magnetic energy fields, that they are emitting those frequencies. And I'm going to quote, "If an object has been passed on down the family, it will contain information about its previous owners. The psychic can then be thought of as a tape player, playing back the information stored on the object." And I found that pretty cool because the analogy of a tape recorder is kind of interesting. Dr. Mario Varvoglis was a PhD at PSI Explorer, and he asserts that psychometry is a special form of clairvoyance and says that the individual performing the psychometry can gain psychic impressions directly from the person to whom the object belongs through telepathy. Again, I'm disputing technical terms here because telepathy is mind-to-mind communication. I would say more empathy, which is emotion to emotion connection, or clairsentience, where you're feeling that. But he says that the individual that's doing that can pick that up either telepathically or clairvoyantly, learn about past or present events in the life of the person. The object might serve just as a kind of focusing device, which keeps the mind from wandering off in irrelevant directions. I will say that having an object in your hand is a more direct thing, but I find with my students that sometimes they don't even have to have that object pass around and hit them and be in their hand. because of our empathic abilities, we can actually sense events and things that are far beyond where we are physically in the world. And these perspectives of psychometry, the sort of art of touch and tell, are really fascinating. And in the next half, I am going to be sharing some personal stories about psychometry and our tales from the other side, and some tips to develop your own psychometric abilities. But first, I'd like to share some amazing examples of psychometric feats in history. Stefan Osowicki was a Russian-born chemical engineer and psychic as well. And he's one of the most famous psychometrists to date. He could see people's auras, and he was able to move objects through psychokinesis, which we'll talk about in another show. That's the physical contact with physical objects through the mental powers. He could locate objects, lost objects, and missing people, and he assisted in several criminal investigations. In 1935, he participated in a test of his psychometric powers that was devised by Dionysi Yonke, and it involved a sealed package. And Yonke had stipulated that this test was to be conducted 8 years after his own death. And they had never met each other. So when Stefan sat down and looked at 14 photographs of men that had been put in front of him, one of them was Yonke, and he picked him out correctly, no problem. And then, even more amazing, he accurately described many details of Yonke's life and correctly identified the man who held the package for the last 8 years, the intercessor between the two. And finally, he was presented with the sealed package that Yonke had prepared before his death, and he touched the package and concentrated. And he said, "Volcanic materials. There's something here that pulls me to other worlds, to another planet. And I sense something about sugar." And inside the package was a meteorite that was wrapped in a candy wrapper. And in later experiments, when he held a 10,000-year-old piece of flint, Osowicki was able to describe it in amazing detail, the lives of the prehistoric people who made it. At the time, there wasn't a lot known about those cultures, but in later times, they verified many of the things that he had said. In other tests, he provided similar descriptions of people who had lived as long ago as 300,000 years. And some of the information he provided, again, was not known by experts, but again, has been confirmed by discoveries more recently. So that's pretty amazing that you could pick up a piece of rock or random bit of something and be able to reach back that far. Another amazing psychometrist was George McMullen. He was a carpenter and a wilderness guide. He became aware of his psychic abilities when he was really young, and he predicted as a child the motorcycle death of a neighbor. Unfortunately, sometimes our first experiences are tied to catastrophic events, and that's one of the reasons some people are afraid to develop their gift. But I guarantee there are way more positive things than negative out there. Anyway, as an adult in 1971, he agreed to undergo a series of psychometric tests that were conducted by J. Norman Emerson, who was an expert in the history of the Iroquois nation, and he handed McMullen a nondescript fragment of a clay cylinder. And McMullen not only identified it as part of a ceremonial pipe, but also was able to describe in detail how it was made and used, and went so far as to draw an accurate picture of the complete object, decorations and all. I think that's just too cool. So now we're entering the part of our show that is our tales from the other side, and usually I share what I consider to be positive tales, but life is not always peaches and roses. Our stories all have some shadow amongst the sunshine of our lives. And today I'm going to ask you to put your CSI hats on and think about the encounters that I share like a forensic scientist would. Think of them as informative and view them with clinical detachment. For me as a medium, I absolutely cannot allow myself to be terrified by what I see. I go in to many places where I'm having to identify what's happened in that space, or in a house clearing, getting rid of entities that may or may not be friendly. It is my job to keep it calm and report it clinically and accurately for my clients. And as you can imagine, it would be really unproductive for a criminal investigator to freak out every time they found a body part or saw a blood spatter. So it is with a medium. It's very important, if you're working as a medium, to be sure that you separate your emotion from that of the spirits that you encounter, and that you don't get involved in the emotion of your client in a way that would distract from the reading. I'm not saying don't be compassionate. Absolutely, we should give our readings with love and compassion. They should be of comfort and counsel. But when your emotion starts to rise, if you're feeling particularly emotional about something that you're conveying, take a breath, take a step back in your perspective a little bit, and allow the client to have the emotion and not you. I've been asked in the past to serve as, for lack of a better word, a psychic detective in crimes that have occurred in the lives of my clients or their loved ones, and to share what I felt, saw, or heard, sometimes to discern a cause of death for a loved one, or what the person had experienced during their actual death or upon crossing over, what their first impressions were as they reached the other side, and what they're doing now. And I do this to help give them closure by giving them a better understanding of the details of the circumstance, because truth, even when it's difficult for us to hear it, gives us a base to work from. And that helps us to begin to heal our lives and to move on from devastation, tragedy, and loss. I've been asked to look into circumstances surrounding the death of several individuals and to determine, is it suicide or murder? Is it intentional? Did they mean to kill themselves, or was it an accidental, perhaps overdose or something like that? And I have clients that are law enforcement agents. I have a DEA agent and some high security government officials and civil servants, some that are prominent members of society and others that are just regular everyday folks that need answers and just want to know. Sometimes for them it's very difficult because it could be months before they receive a proof of what I feel, perhaps in the form of an autopsy report or evidence that's finally released in maybe a murder investigation, etc., or details that are provided by a private investigator or law enforcement official once those reports are available. And that creates a verification of what I've sensed for them. I always encourage my clients to seek professional verification of what I give them. I'm not afraid for them to look into it and find out the facts, because I trust that the information that I'm receiving is 100% correct. That given it's also the perspective. So psychic ability or mediumship ability is exact in its emotional impact and in the symbols and feelings of what's given. Sometimes doesn't render itself in a way that people are sometimes want yes, no answers or very specific information. And sometimes that is available, and sometimes that's just not the way that Spirit gives it to us. Because we don't work in our left brain, we work in our right brain, and Spirit has a multitude of ways of proving the truths that they exist and the facts that are given that are accurate. So when someone gets verification, I do find out that the information or the places, objects that have spoken to me, the spirits that have spoken to me, are dead on, no pun intended. Other times, due to the nature of the crime or the lack of physical evidence, there aren't any proofs. And what I sense becomes their only channel of information regarding that situation. This doesn't make it any less important. What is important is that they're finally able to begin to move on with their lives, to learn to live with the realities of what's happened, and to no longer be defined by them, to be freer from the devastation of the circumstances that they have endured, to know that those that suffered are still alive and that they are still able to communicate with them. I don't have to be on the site to sense these things. Most probably good mediums wouldn't have to be, and it can be done remotely. It's always affirming to have the evidence bear out the way that we perceive it. Accuracy, needless to say, is essential. And the emotions that are attached to that kind of work can be very challenging. The emotions not only of the client, but also of the spirit that's trying to convey their messages. But I really love what I do, and I wanted to share some examples of psychometric things with you today. The first time that I encountered it was when I was a fairly new reader. When I first started reading, I would give drawings. I would draw to try to explain what I was seeing in people's auric fields or some of the images or symbols that were given to me. Now I do that less unless it's specifically required or requested, and I enjoy it when I do. This time my client came and she really surprised me because she had brought two objects with her. And I'm just going to refer to one of them. She brought a pair of glasses in a little case. And the second that I touched it, I got the impression of her husband being the owner of the glasses. I could see him sitting in a den with the kitchen off to the side, off to the left side, and her going around dusting and puttering around the house, preparing dinner, happy in their space. And he would read the paper and pretend like he didn't see her. But it was pretty evident that he was fully aware of her, firing on all cylinders when she came into the room, and he was conveying his attraction and love and admiration for her and how wonderful he thought she was. And he didn't really necessarily tell her that. Maybe in his actions he did, but he never just walked up to her and said, "You are wonderful." But he was completely enamored of her. She was his Geiger counter. She was his compass. She was his GPS. Like wherever she went, he was focused on her. She received the message beautifully. It touched her very deeply. And she confirmed that that is how their relationship was, that the glasses had belonged to him, and that he fit the physical description that I had given her of him as well. And the fact that he would read the paper as she cleaned the home, and that she actually was aware that he had watched her. And I just thought that was a precious, precious story. So I thought also I might share with you some of the other psychometric stories that I gained as a realtor before I actually even started doing this professionally. I'm going to save some of my psychic detective stories for another episode, but I'm going to share some that I found interesting. And one of them had to do with me and my ex-husband, Hazem. Hazem and I were driving and traveling out of the area, and we stopped at a Waffle House, a particular one in a state that I will not disclose. And as we went in, we were talking, and really it was a romantic beginning of our marriage, and we were deep in conversation. And when we walked in, I started to feel that there was a lot of hatred directed toward us. And I didn't think of it at the time, but it was because perhaps we were in an area that was very limited in their thinking, and he was from the Middle East and I'm not. And we must have upset their sense of proper relations or something like that. But I wasn't thinking of it at the time. I just really felt this tremendous hatred toward us. And I went in the bathroom and I got a really horrific, and this is where you brace yourself and go CSI with me. I went in the bathroom and to all appearances, it was just an empty, clean bathroom. But I saw a woman who had been stabbed multiple times and blood just everywhere in that bathroom. And I don't think I actually used the toilet because the imagery was so tremendously strong. And I came out and I looked at Hazem and I said, I think we should go. And he's like, yes. Got in the car and drove out of the parking lot. And as we got further and further away from that really negative vibration that we were feeling, we both began to talk about what it was that we had sensed. And both of us had had a distinct feeling that if we had stayed, we both would have been murdered. It was a very intense situation. Then, maybe on a similar note, dealing with my real estate specifically, I was showing property to a well-heeled family. We were looking at some amazing properties. This was a very large house and beautifully situated, great view on top of a mountain, ample square footage, lovely, lovely house. And as we were coming into a particular bedroom, I had such a graphic view of someone chasing someone up a stairs with a shotgun and the fear that they had. Then I looked down at the carpet and there were these little tiny, what looked to me to be like little droplets of blood. Then in the back room, again, there was more. And there were some bits. I told you, keep CSI with me, embedded in the wall there. And those were physical things that I was seeing, but I had felt the drama of that chase. And my client happened to be a forensic scientist. We got all CSI ourselves, and she had a pair of tweezers in her purse, and we found a Ziploc bag in the drawer of the house, and she took it home to her lab and did identify it as a human source there. The realtor that had the house listed was denying that she had any knowledge that anything like that had happened, but my client, who was also quite clairvoyant as well, and I confirmed many details of our perception about what we felt between that. And of course, those last two examples are kind of scary a little bit, in the sense that it was a terrible circumstance, but it wasn't fearful for either of us to experience that, because again, we were looking at it with a clinical detachment and a knowledge that we were safe in that environment. Those negative energies could not touch us at all. Another thing occurred when I was a young realtor and just beginning my process of being a medium. I had a friend of mine call me and she said, "Hey, do you want to come over to my mom's house and tell me what you feel?" I was like, "Sure, okay." And I had no idea what was in store for me. So we got to her house and we made a deal, like she would not tell me anything until I was done. And I would describe to her what I felt as I went through the house. We come in the front hall of the house, and I felt that it was a place of greeting and ritual kind of thing, very regular environment. And then I went off into the bathroom off to the right, and I got the impression of a young man who was hanging from the ceiling. And mind you, this was the beginning of me working as a psychic medium. Even though I have had experiences since birth, I was just beginning to put things together. And I looked up at the ceiling and there wasn't anything up there. There weren't any rafters. There weren't anything. It was just a flat ceiling. There weren't even any light fixtures up there. And I looked up there and I thought, that was weird. And I walked out of the room and I walked back in the room and I looked at the ceiling, and she starts to laugh, but she doesn't tell me why at the time. Then I went in the room across from the bathroom, and there were these two male energies that were very aggressive. They just kind of came up to me and they were posturing by puffing their chest out and trying to be very distracting and bossy. We went up to the second floor, and I felt in one room that there had been a fire, and there was something about a rabbit that had been a pet that had died in that fire. But when I looked at the floorboards and at the paint, the baseboards of the room, there was absolutely no evidence that that fire had been there. And then there was like a kitchen area that had been built onto the back porch, and I felt a woman's spirit run by me, and she was in utter and total panic, and she ran through me down to where the kitchen was there, but apparently it had been a porch, and was trying to escape from the porch. And then we went up to the attic, as if that's not enough. Oops, forgot one room on that second level. There was one room I couldn't enter. I felt like if I entered it, I would die. So I just said, no, I think I'll pass on this room. And then we went up to the attic, and there were 3 areas of emotion embedded in the attic. There was an area that I felt was very secretive, and I pointed to that area and I said, this is a place of secrets. Then I pointed to another area, and I felt that this was a place of reflection. It was to the front of the house. It was by a window. And then there was another area where I had an image of those two young men doing terrible things to young women. And I won't go into detail because I don't like to add energy to anything that is of low vibration, but it wasn't pretty. So I finished my assessment of the house. I'm a little racked because I didn't expect to find that much of a psychic story, and I hadn't done this as sort of a professional thing officially before. So she began to confirm the stories, and she said, yes, in the hallway where you felt the ritual and the greeting, she says every night at 11, this particular woman who was a nurse comes home. She comes as a spirit through the door. It's sort of her ritual. And yes, there was a young man that hung himself in that bathroom. And it was his mother that had Alzheimer's that he would put up in the attic when he went to work. And she would just stare out the window. It was her place of contemplation. And she told me that the two young men that I felt had something to do with the darkness upstairs, and confirmed that there were two men that used to be predators that would entice young women back and do horrific things to them in the attic. There was another room that I felt feeling that I would die if I went in there. And she told me, and I have no way to verify this, that she and her sister were in that room, and a knife, a dagger, materialized at full speed in thin air and nearly struck them and embedded itself in the wall behind them. So I'm really glad I didn't have that experience for myself. That would have freaked me out pretty badly. And then the place of secrets, she said, right under the floorboards where I had pointed, her mother had found a box of letters and pictures that were hidden there by the nurse, and they told the story of her life and her loves, her personal thoughts. Upstairs in the attic, you could see the charring of the wood as it was over that room that I had felt there had been a fire in and couldn't see evidence of. Never do know about what the rabbit was, but I'm sure somebody does. If you would like to develop your exercises, I'm going to have to shift really quickly to our psychic development exercise. The best thing is to just test yourself. Find out what you can do. Hold crystals or stones, feel their energies and properties. See what you think they would be best used for in terms of adjusting your energies, or maybe gifting them to someone to add to their strengths. One fun thing is to take cards, just regular playing cards, hold them upside down and see if you can sense, are they red or black? Are they a face card or a number card? If they're a number card, is it a high number or a low number? Can you get the number? Another way to develop your psychometric ability would be to use paint chip and try to sense the colors. Well, we've enjoyed our show. I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you would like more information, please feel free to visit me at mediumtracylockwood.com. Just remember that it is never inappropriate to be kind, and without integrity, you have nothing. I hope to see you next week for our guest, Linda Ferguson, who is a wonderful author, and she's going to be talking to us about third and fourth dimensional reality. Take care.